class. All right. So we're continuing on page 189 with overview of Islamic civilization. It's very interesting that the authors decided to take a divergent step. Instead of talking about a particular country, like they have been, like Mexico or Russia, things like that, here, all of a sudden, they're talking about Islamic civilization, Islamic world. So that's a little bit unusual, right? It's going to step away. All of a sudden, they shift it, how they address it. And I think it's, it's worthwhile, actually. Why? Because cohesively, Islamic civilization is kind of all together, and there are a lot of little, sometimes very small, sometimes large cities, states, countries that are kind of onto themselves, but they actually fit into a greater whole. So as a result, this is what the authors of the book decide to do, is they decide to talk about Islamic civilization as a bigger whole, not focusing on a particular country or anything like that. Okay, so of course, studying Islam and studying Islamic civilization, studying the history of these people is relevant to all of us. Why? Because about 3.5 million people in US alone are Muslims. Okay, they're basically going to be largest religion right after Christianity. Right now, they're the largest religion. There may come a time when they actually overtake and become more numerous than Christians in this country. So historically speaking, the United States has been a dominated, culture dominated by Christianity. That may change in the near future, just because of the numbers of Muslims that there are and the popularity of Islam and the, how many people become Muslims, even out of America. So, so it is right now the second largest religion in the world as it is to be, second to Christianity only. And it is a little bit younger than Christianity. So maybe that's why it's only second and not first. I don't know. There could be reasons for that. That's arguable. We don't really know why, but basically you have 1.6 billion, over 1/5 of the world's population are Muslim. And they're not confined to one continent, one country, one particular place. There are Muslims, they're not ethnicity, per se. There are Muslims who look like Asians, completely Asian looking Muslims. And then there's Muslims who look like Middle Easterners, and there's Muslims in European countries who look completely American, right? And yet they're Muslims. So it's not really one ethnicity or one people group. We're talking about a religion. So an Islamic civilization spans all that, and it provides a cohesive identity base for a lot of people. And so as we've already studied Islam and kind of delved into it a little bit, let's dive a little more. There are sort of ages or development stages to Islamic civilization that this book highlights. And even Islamic scholars themselves like to talk about the primary stages of their civilization as the age of ignorance. Okay, so basically you could say that pre-Islamic era is when all the early Arab tribes, we're talking about Arabian Peninsula as the place of origin, which is pretty much dry and arid. Not a lot of stuff grows there. It's a desert. Is pretty much pastoral lifestyle. That means people basically herd sheep. They're not farmers. They're not farming grain fields or anything like that. So very different lifestyle. They move around from place to place. Few wells here and there, few oases here and there, and they move around those places. They trade. So their economy is completely different. So this is, this era is basically you have all these Arab tribes that are very, pastoral people. They're completely disassociated from each other, their clans, their families. And this age of ignorance, the reason why Muslims call it that is because they basically did not know God, is what the way they understood it. They're all over the place when it comes to religion. Some of them follow local religions. Some of them are doing ancestor worship. Others are practicing magic and animism and things like that. So idolatry of all sorts. Some are Christians, some are Jews. So they're all over the place. Now, and that's what Muslims call the age of ignorance, is basically before the revelation of Muhammad, before Quran comes to be. And interestingly enough, the textbook highlights some cultural values, which I'm going to say to you still exist today, because these are pre-Islamic values. They have nothing to do with Islam. They are Eastern values. They are typical of many other Easterners who are not Muslims as well, okay? And these are the values that, and by the way, if you read the Bible, you'll see those same very values. The family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they exhibit the same exact Eastern values. So pre-Judaism, pre-Islam, if you want to think about it. These are the values. Look at this. This is on page 190. They say they have their code of values: bravery in battle, patience in misfortune, okay, persistence in revenge. Revenge is a huge part of Middle Eastern culture. If you don't know about this, there's a reason why in the Bible the cities of refuge were set up. Remember, if you read in the Bible, the cities of refuge were created to stop the cycle of revenge. If I accidentally killed somebody from your family, meaning accidentally, not on purpose, I can run to the city of refuge and I will be protected by the people of the city and by the law of that city, so that you cannot go after me and kill me. So the culture of revenge is, in the Bible. And so Bible is trying to contravene that culture by creating cities of refuge, because otherwise you have clans that go at each other until they wipe each other out completely from the face of the earth. Because if I kill your relative and you go after me and you kill me, then my relative now is obligated by the code of honor to go after you. And the bloodshed never stops until one of our clans is completely gone. You could see how that's very self-defeating to a culture. And that's why Torah, says, all right, we're going to fight this by creating this institution of the cities of refuge. But this is a very Middle Eastern thing. Persistence in revenge. Revenge is something very important. It has to do with honor. It's not just tit for tat. This is a big sense of honor that is being protected. Protection of the weak. All right, you see that in the story of Lot and the angels, right? They come to him. And he says, here, take my daughters. Don't touch my visitors. Remember that story? That is that Eastern culture, protecting the weak, defense of the strong, defiance of the strong, loyalty to the tribe, hospitality to the guest, generosity to the needy, and fidelity in carrying out promises. These are all right there in the Bible. As you read the early stories of the patriarchs, they're all, generosity, hospitality to strangers. Abraham is sitting by his tent. He sees travelers coming from afar. He just circumcised himself several days ago. He's an old man. He's like 90s, okay? He circumcised himself. Can you imagine that? And then he gets up and runs, and he sees visitors coming from afar. He says, come into my tent. Let me fix you something to eat. Let me give you some drink. Why would a 90-year-old man who's recovering from a surgery that he just did on himself would run and grab visitors who are just passing by and says, come into my tent and eat with me and drink with me? It's because of that value of hospitality to strangers. Looking to make friends with people you do not know, essentially, is a feature of a Middle Eastern culture, which, by the way, still exists in Islam, but it's not an Islamic value. It's a value from pre-Islamic era. And so you'll see this in the Bible, very much expressed. Trustworthiness, keeping your promises, all the covenants in the Bible, all the promises, they're all found on that foundation. The stories of Jacob and Laban, for example, are all about keeping promises and not keeping promises. That culture is very, very much right there in the Bible, because essentially, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Laban, all of these are Middle Eastern people that are, living within the laws and the values of that world, and knowing those values will help you understand even the Bible better. But anyway, and this will help you understand Muslim people better, because these are the values that is typical of all Middle Easterners. Okay, and basically, in that early age of ignorance, people lived fighting with each other because they were tribes warring with each other. And then comes the rise of Islam as Muhammad receives his revelation around year 610. He starts to gather followers and he starts to preach his message of revelation of one God, not many gods. And basically, Muhammad, as he teaches, he sets up this belief system, but there's a problem. And the problem is this: when Muhammad dies, he does not have male heirs, so nobody inherits his title, nobody inherits what he has built, and now people have to fight it out for the power. Who is the rightful person to continue to carry on his work? And so essentially what is being set up is the rightly guided caliphs, or the caliphate that's patriarchal. Those are his closest disciples. They basically become the leaders, his disciples, basically, and they lead people for a while. Then it moves to the history of different caliphates. And you have a list here on page 91 where you could read the dates and the names of the caliphates as it moves through. Now, I'm not going to go through all the caliphates. I want to note basically that some important features that are really, really important here. The big deal is the split between the Sunni and the Shia, okay, that people have to understand. So this is during the Umayyad Caliphate, basically. As Islam spreads into Iran and Afghanistan and Asia and Philippines and further on, it becomes sort of a majority minority. So there's a split in Islam where basically the two branches are now arguing. And one branch of Islam believes that the leader of Islam is the person who's best qualified to lead, okay? Meaning you're qualified by your achievement, by who you are. And the other one basically says, no, it's the heredity. It's the person who inherits it. So just because so-and-so was the leader and they had a son, so that son is now the leader. Good, bad, competent, incompetent, who cares? They're the leader. They have the right. So you have two groups of people basically now within religion fighting for who should lead the religion. People who inherited it, or people who actually know what they're doing. So that's the big fight between Sunni and Shia. It's about leadership. Who is qualified to lead Islam? Islam has been centrally led for many, many ages, and that tends to be the desire, so to say, for many people who are Muslim, is to have that unity of leadership. And that is a problem because now you have multiple countries with secular governments set up and things like that with their own constitutions and their own rules and laws. And so now you have a religion in conflict with state. So you could see how that gets complicated. And that's why you have a lot of monarchies, like Saudi Arabia being a monarchy, where you have Iran, where you have the Islam clerics essentially leading the country. Where here, in one country it's the king that rules, in another country it's the religious leader that rules. So who's in charge, basically? Who's supposed to lead the country? So one country says, oh, we're better, we're more righteous because we're guided by the Islam, because we're allowing our religious leaders to guide us. Another country says, no, we have a king, that's how we're going to be guided. And so now they're fighting a war. Essentially over these things. So there's a lot of civil war that goes on even between Muslims themselves. And so as we go through the different caliphates, an important part of history that should not be missed out is the Crusades. Okay, so you have the Abbasid Caliphate. that moves its power to Baghdad, and then Baghdad becomes the center, and then eventually Syria becomes the center of Islam. So you kind of Islam's centralized power moves from city to city. But at some point, you have Christians who come and try to retake the Middle East, let's put it that way. And remember, Christianity, the birthplace of Christianity is Jerusalem. And a lot of the holy places for the Christians are in Jerusalem, the Holy Land. So Christians, that's important to them. Jews, of course, is important to them. Why? Because that's their entire country and that's their origin. So all of their holy places are obviously going to be in there. But at this point, what you have is you have a clash of civilizations. You have a massive Islamic civilization that is powerful and strong. And you have a massive Christian civilization that's powerful and strong. And they have a claim to the same holy places. And they're fighting a turf war. So essentially, you have 200 years of bloodshed that we call the Crusades. Okay. What happened is it all begins with the Turks, who basically at that time were dominating the Islamic world. So in 1055, they drove out the Byzantine Christians from Baghdad and from Asia Minor and places like that. So Christians were basically pushed out from the historical lands in which Christianity was established. Okay, and when that happened, the Westerners, and specifically the Pope, is proclaimed a call to save fellow Christians and to save the holy places and to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. You know, hey, they're not letting us come and worship. They're destroying our churches. They're not letting us live where we want to live. So we're going to fight them back. And so basically the Crusades begin, and that's 200 years worth of war where the European nations now get large armies and march down to the Middle East and try to take it over militarily from Muslims. And in the end, they end up slaughtering lots of Jews too, by the way. So they don't just kill Muslims, they kill Jews, they kill everybody who's not Christian. They don't really care. They're there to take over. So a lot of bloodshed, very, very, very bloody, very sad part of history. Okay, so but in the end, Muslims win because Saladin basically defeats Christian armies, and he takes over Jerusalem from the Christians again. And to give credit, Saladin is actually very moderate, and he's actually very nice to both Christians and Jews, and he lets people worship in their holy places. He does not subjugate them. He treats them fairly. He lets them have their holy places rather than to try to create conflict. So he's basically more moderate than Christians. He's less brutal to his enemies. When he has control, when he has power, Saladin was more fair. Let's put it that way. And so then later, the Mongols invade that part of the world, and out of that comes the great Ottoman Empire, and Ottomans take over the entire lands that were controlled by Islam, and they rule out of Turkey, and essentially they control the Holy Land as well. And then later, the Ottomans are defeated in World War I by the European powers. And that's how the entire Middle East is reshaped. The entire Middle East is now reshaped because what was an Islamic empire, what was ruled by the Ottoman Turks, essentially now is European. Because all these countries that were part of the First World War that Ottoman Empire got involved in, now they were conquered and taken over, and that means war is war. If I win, that means your land is mine and I can do whatever I want. That's the rule of war. You should not have gotten involved in a war if you didn't want to be conquered, basically. So that's what happens. They take over all those lands and they start colonizing them. You know the history of Western colonization. That's no different. So eventually those countries do gain independence. Many of them do. That's how we have, for example, the country of Israel is, established by the British. British controlled that part. And country of Jordan is established out of that same exact environment. And so is Syria and Lebanon and those other places. So, Saudi Arabia is a kingdom, Turkey becomes an independent state, things like that. But all of that is carved out by the Western powers, essentially. And most of those countries become independent in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, 1900s, through a series of events, because the Westerners basically lose control of those places. And that's how we have all these countries. But before that, there was one big unified Islamic civilization. Okay, and that's why the authors address the Islamic civilization in kind of like a bigger whole, rather than a bunch of little city-states and small states and countries, because those are fairly new. Okay, so you could see how the legacy of Islamic history will affect Muslims, and it will affect how they think, how they feel, how they understand the West. The history of the Crusades is definitely still a very big part of Islamic world understanding. They are distrustful of Europeans, and Crusades, for you, maybe something that you heard about happened hundreds of years ago, but to people who are living in the Middle East, it's as if it happened yesterday. They're still feeling it, let's put it that way, and they're passionate about it. It's a big deal of their history that they're not dismissing or forgetting. It's a big part of, it's a wound that keeps on sort of hurting, let's put it that way. So sometimes when people look at Islamic civilization, they tend to oversimplify it, and that's a very Western, notion. We look at the Islam and they say all Islam is basically a bunch of people fighting wars with each other, and that's all it has been, and that's all it will be. And so you can look at all the history and all the caliphs and all the different groups that come in and take over and rule as just a series of wars. And so Islam is a religion of war. That's all they really know. That's all they really do. Well, some people look at it that way, and if you're going to be fair, well, you can look at the American history the same way. Here come colonizers who take over American Indians, wipe them out, take Mexico on, take half of Mexican's territory, created the United States. We could say the same thing about Americans. It's all about wars. And then we get involved in all these First World War, Second World War. Now we're fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and Korea and everywhere else, in Vietnam. I mean, it's like we could say the same thing about American history, is that Americans are a warlike nation and their entire history is just war, war, war. You could be unfair like that. It's much more complicated than that. So, but as Muslims look at their own history, they take great pride in a time in the civilization when Europe was going through the Dark Ages, when in Europe science was suppressed. Okay, when scientists in Europe basically were burned at the stake. The church was actually persecuting people who were saying that the world is not flat. Okay, at that moment, in Muslim lands, science was welcomed. Mathematicians thrived. Physicists developed their ideas. People who wanted to experiment with how the world works were allowed to experiment with new thoughts and new ideas. And so basically, as the Europe was burning people at the stake for not thinking like everybody else thinks, or whatever the church says, Islam was going through a great revolution of knowledge and progress. And so they were advancing forward in medicine and art and literature and math and everything you can imagine. So, but, nothing stays the same. Essentially, Islam also entered into a period of decline, and basically people are still looking to that golden age, and they are trying to figure out how to get out of that period of decline, because while Islam as a religion is growing, culturally speaking, the contribution of Islam beyond its religious knowledge is not at that same level of when it was back in the Middle Ages, basically. Nowhere near. So, and that's something that people are looking forward to. They want to restore the glory of their Islamic civilization back to what it used to be. That is the yearning. That is the hope. Yet so far, nobody has been able to achieve something like that. And so for the most part, all the lands where Islam is sort of say the dominant way of life, it's fairly dismal. A lot of poverty, so a lot of problems. For a lot of Muslims, their values are being eroded every day because they're living in countries that are overcrowded and poverty stricken. And it's very difficult to maintain dignity in a place like that. Islamic culture and biblical culture, basically, ancient Middle Eastern culture teaches you that in order to become a good husband, a good man, you must have a place to live. You have to be able to support a wife, at least one. And so when you're living in a depressed economic society, how can you have a place to live and raise a family? And you're supposed to do that before you get married, But if you're not well off enough, then you basically don't deserve to get married. So there's a lot of a disruption, sort of say a social fiber disruption that happens because of how people live. So the countries sort of say still trying to look for those glory days, and there is a huge disdain among many Muslim countries for Western values. Muslims perceive as Western values, and even more so American values in particular, as disrupting their society and destroying their way of life, and their ideas are sort of say poisonous and destructive, and so on and so forth. So, which is why that whole war with the West, basically exists. So they kind of blame the West for a lot of their problems, which may not be entirely fair, but nevertheless, that's what goes on. So the historical memory of the Islamic Golden Age basically provides the impetus for people to manipulate other people and say, well, if you want to restore that, then you have to fight for it. And that's what we have. That's why the terrorism rises up. That's why people fight the West. That's why America is called the big Satan, things like that. It's sad to say, but that is, some segments of Islam choose to, refer to America as the big Satan. So what the authors, I think, say that's really important in this textbook about Islam, and I like this a lot, they say, in short, the more we understand Islam and Muslims, the more interculturally competent we become, because religion is embodied in culture. And I think that can be said about everybody else as well, but they chose to say this about Islam and Muslims. So Islamic civilization is not so easy to understand, not so easy to comprehend, because you have to study the history and you have to study Islam as a religion to understand them. But the more you do understand them, the more you will understand why people are the way they are, and what is it that moves them, what motivates them, what are their values. Middle Eastern values are pretty awesome values. They're very biblical values. Like I said, they're right there in the Bible. Something that I think many Christians can identify with, because that Abrahamic lifestyle essentially is what we're talking about. These are all embedded in a Middle Eastern culture, and Muslims very much affect them, accept them by default. But as we study all these cultures, to wrap this up in a general way, basically what this chapter tried to do is it tried to help you understand how these cultural values that we see in different people are connected to the past and connected to specific historical events and specific historical developments, to the collective memory, to the values that rise up from history, and a lot of times from geography. Geography affects the way we develop as people, as cultures, as people groups, and the way we continue to behave. So Americans are who they are because partially their geography and partially their history. The same is true of Japanese, and the same is true of Mexicans, and the same is true of Arabs and Muslims, and in general. So I don't care who you're talking about. Essentially, cultures and their histories are intertwined, and the more you know about the events that changed and shaped people's lives, the more you can be a better, more perceptive communicator with them. There are personal differences between us, and when we know those personal differences, we are able to be more successful by making fewer mistakes when we talk with each other. And I know certain values of certain people, and I also know their dislikes. And I'm definitely not going to push those buttons when I am communicating with them, because it doesn't serve me well to make people upset about the things that I know they are already upset about. And so me annoying them is not going to accomplish any more. So the point of these chapters is really to expand your awareness and understanding of the beliefs and the values and the behaviors of the dominant cultures and societies that exist today. You know, wherever you may be, these ones that we studied about, the ones that the textbook picked out, they believe those to be most relevant, and that's why they honed in on those. You know, obviously this is a textbook written for the American, universities, so, and that's why it's structured the way it's structured, and so please appreciate it for that reason. So basically, the more you know about other culture, the greater is the likelihood that you will be a competent and more effective communicator, because that knowledge, that awareness, guides you in your communicative process. That's why in communication, we study culture, religion, history, and things like that. So in the next chapter, which we're actually going to break up into two sections, chapter 6, you can look the pages that I want you to read in the syllabus. I expect you to, maybe do a little bit more discussion with me, because we're going to talk about cultural values and we're going to talk about behavior. I think that all of you guys have quite a bit of experience with cultural values and behavior, and especially if you have interacted with people from other cultures and understand a little bit about them now that we've spent several chapters talking about different beliefs and values and behaviors. Essentially, now we can get to the actual, actions that we perform and look back, where does this come from, and analyze it. And so I'm looking to a little bit more discussion, which is why we're breaking out the next chapter into two smaller chunks and conquering it that way. So that's something to move forward. And also one more mention as I close the class, the exercise, look at that. So you have that as well in your class plan over there for you, in your lesson plans. So just click on that, complete that. If hopefully by now you figured out how to use Poply, you download it and then you complete it, then you upload it. It's really that simple, and I'll be able to see that. If you have trouble with it, you can't figure it out, you can always email it to me, but you don't have to duplicate. If you upload it to the website, it's there. I'll see it. Okay. Any questions? Any questions about class procedure? Anything that needs to be addressed as we close the class? Anything?
I have one question.
Shoot.
For the exercise number 2.
Okay.
And then I read the 2 questions, but in the first one, and that they're saying how they brought the specific values, but I have no idea. Do I have to make four? I mean, 3 different, 4 different values. Do I have to make? Do I have to write down 4 different values, or
I don't need you to make anything up. I want you to identify them. Okay. So your question is, let's see. Your question is about part 1 or part 2? Well, I ask you to identify which historical events or factors might have affected your culture the most. So look at your own culture. Tell me what parts of